Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Bryan Clark, a senior fellow at the Institute and director of the Hudson Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. We're delighted today to have a great panel on discussion about the invisible battlefield, regaining electromagnetic spectrum superiority for the United States military. We're going to have a brief on the report that we recently released at Hudson on that subject and a panel discussion to follow with some terrific guests. I'm going to introduce them now. Congressman Jim Langevin is from Rhode Island's 2nd Congressional District. He's a senior member of the House Armed Services Committee, and he's chairman of the Cyber Innovative Technologies and Information Systems Subcommittee. He also serves on the subcommittees for Sea Power and Projection Forces and Strategic Forces. Congressman Langevin has been a longtime leader on securing our nation's technology infrastructure against cyber threats. He co-founded the Congressional Cybersecurity Caucus to increase awareness around this issue. He's also co-chair of the bipartisan Congressional Career and Technology Education Caucus, where they advocate to improve and increase access for training to give students the opportunity to fit the needs of expanding industries. But most importantly for this conversation, he's co-chair, along with our other panelists, Congressman Don Bacon, of the Electromagnetic Spectrum Operations Caucus in the House. Congressman Langevin has also championed passage of bipartisan bills to expand services to families caring for elderly and disabled loved ones, breakthrough law to protect foster youth, and he's been a strong advocate for inclusion and independence for people with disabilities and helped pass the ADA Amendments Act. He's been in Congress since 2000. Congressman Don Bacon from Nebraska's 2nd District serves on the House Armed Services Committee and the House Agriculture Committee. He's also co-chair, as I said, of the Electromagnetic Spectrum Operations Caucus. Congressman Bacon learned firsthand on his family farm the value of hard work and how commitment contributes to the success of a small business. After graduating from Northern Illinois University, he served nearly 30 years in the United States Air Force, where he specialized in electronic warfare, intelligence, and reconnaissance, and ultimately retired as a brigadier general. In total, his 16 assignments included 4 deployments around the world, 3 of which were in the Middle East, and 1 assignment in Iraq in 2007 and 2008 during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Among his numerous awards are the Air Force Distinguished Service Medal, the Bronze Star, and Legion of Merit. Furthermore, Congressman Bacon earned 2 master's degrees while he was in the military, one from the University of Phoenix in Arizona and the National War College in Washington, D.C. He's been in Congress since 2016. Mr. Dave Tremper has been Director of Electronic Warfare in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment since 2020, or since last year, where he oversees electronic warfare and electromagnetic spectrum operation policy. He leads the Electromagnetic Warfare Cross-Functional Team and is the Executive Secretary of the Electromagnetic Warfare Executive Committee. Before joining OSD last year, Mr. Tremper was a DARPA program manager where he'd been since 2017, working on electromagnetic warfare programs. And prior to DARPA, he served 9 years as a program manager at the Office of Naval Research, working on electronic warfare and electromagnetic spectrum operations systems, as well as counterintelligence and surveillance for both standalone and networked system applications. During his time with the Office of Naval Research, he led development and successful transition of several electronic support and electronic attack capabilities, as well as air and missile defense, suppression of enemy air defense systems, and counter-improved explosive device systems. He's received numerous awards, including both the Department of the Navy Superior Service Award and the Meritorious Civilian Service Award, the Future Naval Capability Program Manager of the Year, and also the North Atlantic Treaty Organization Scientific Achievement Award. He's received a Bachelor of Science degree from Catholic University of America in Electrical Engineering and a master's degree in Electrical Engineering from Clarkson University. Dr. Maren Lead is the Executive Director of the National Spectrum Consortium, where she's responsible for serving as the primary interface with the National Spectrum Consortium's government sponsors, its members, as well as overseeing the consortium's operations on a day-to-day basis. Her experience in DoD, the Congress, and in think tanks has enabled her to work on concepts, technology requirements, prototype development, and transition of technologies from numerous perspectives. She spent almost half of the last 15 years as a senior advisor to this DoD's most senior military officials, including the Chief of Naval Operations, the Chief of the Staff of the Army, and 2 Vice Chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. During the mid-2000s, she traveled repeatedly to Iraq to help facilitate more effective electromagnetic warfare organizations and technology fielding. And prior to that, she was a professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee and served on several caucuses on a bicameral basis over in the Congress. Most recently, she was program director for digital warfare at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, where she focused on analysis and prototyping for Defense Department sponsors and information technology architectures. She also led and supported several defense-related policy analyses at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and at the RAND Corporation. She received her PhD in quantitative analysis from the RAND Party Graduate School and her AB in political science from Occidental College. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here today. This promises to be a terrific discussion. And we're going to start with a brief discussion of the recent report that we released at Hudson, the Invisible Battlefield Technology Strategy for Regaining Electromagnetic Spectrum Superiority.
The study we recently released at Hudson called the Invisible Battlefield, a Technology Strategy for Electromagnetic Spectrum Superiority. I'm going to brief this along with Timothy Walton, who did the study with me. This study was also supported by Steve and Melinda Taranjo of Warrior Support Solutions, who we brought on board for their other electromagnetic warfare expertise. Next slide, Tim. The study was really driven in large part by the challenge that we're facing from a comprehensive set of electromagnetic spectrum warfare systems being deployed by our adversaries, particularly China, which is depicted in this picture here on the left-hand side, which is from some of their brochures depicting some of the systems that they're developing, which are very comprehensively oriented to try to exploit all the vulnerabilities they perceive in the U.S. system of systems as they currently perceive them. Our networks, our electromagnetic spectrum sensors, and our ability to employ them effectively on the battlefield. To counter those Chinese and Russian developments, we're faced with a very tight fiscal situation over in the United States side. So on the right-hand side of this slide, we're showing that even within the federal budget and the defense budget, even if that budget does not change, we're still being constrained in terms of the future procurement and research and development funding we have available by the rising operations and support costs associated with the force. So even if budgets don't shrink, we're still going to be facing a shrinking portion of the budget being available for research and development of new capabilities and fielding of those new capabilities. So trying to address this comprehensive threat in a way that's trying to attack system versus system is probably not going to be effective. We won't have the time or the money to be successful in that way. Next slide. Instead, we looked at using a net assessment approach. And this approach was used during the Cold War very effectively to identify ways to get a strategic advantage over an opponent that's got a very comprehensive way of trying to counter your efforts. So in the case of the Soviet Union, we pursued in the United States a series of capability investments that were designed to exploit vulnerabilities that were perceived by the Soviets in their air defenses, in undersea warfare, and in some other areas. Here in this case, we're looking at both the Russian competitor and the Chinese competitor, and we're looking for ways that we can exploit vulnerabilities that they perceive or that we perceive in them by looking at a series of asymmetries. So exploring how they are going to do electromagnetic spectrum operations and also how we do them, and identifying some of the asymmetries between our two countries and our two ways of doing warfare. Those asymmetries can be used to identify a series of technology priorities that would help us to leverage some of our existing advantages while exploiting some of their vulnerabilities. Tim, you take the next slide.
Thank you, Brian. So as we looked at US adversaries, we found that both of them are prioritizing the information competition, in particular, decision-making as the primary competition in warfare. And they're orienting all sorts of different types of kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities to focus on information. In the PLA, as we review PLA doctrine concepts, they have a concept called now regarding modern warfare as having an informationized character, which means that all different contemporary military systems have information systems in them. And in support of an informationized approach to warfare, they've developed a concept called systems destruction warfare, which aims to systematically degrade the operational systems of adversaries like the United States. One of the primary ways that they're focused on doing this is by targeting the different types of information flows, both by restricting them, but also manipulating them in the electromagnetic space, in the network space, which refers to the networked domain, including but not limited to the cyber domain, and then in terms of the cognitive or psychological space. And they view as opportunities to, by coordinating actions in these three spheres, be able to shape and influence US decision-making. Similarly, the Russian armed forces view there being an ongoing information confrontation between the US, Russia, and other countries in the world. And it has two primary elements, this information technological component and an information psychological component, similar to the cognitive phrasing that the Chinese use. And electronic warfare, cyber operations, human intelligence activities, and other whole of government actions all support an informationized approach where they're seeking to gain information advantage. When we looked at Chinese capabilities in terms of how they're organizing their force, we found that a very significant event took place in 2006 when Hudson, who was then the chairman of the Central Military Commission, said that information dominance is in effect electromagnetic dominance, so he prioritized the electromagnetic spectrum as central to operations and called on the entire People's Liberation Army to prepare for operations in contested electromagnetic environments. Since then, the PLA has thoroughly organized its forces. Pretty much all significant units have the abilities and training to be able to reduce their signatures, employ camouflage, and employ active and passive decoys of various types. They've also continued to reorganize the force, and in 2015, they established the Network Electronic Bureau within the Joint Staff. And this Network Electronic Bureau is responsible for electronic warfare capability requirement setting and overview of both electronic warfare and cyber missions throughout the force. They also established the Strategic Support Force, which combines the activities of electromagnetic spectrum operations, cyber, space, and psychological operations in support of this informationized approach to warfare. And throughout the Strategic Support Force, they have some dedicated units that are focused on some long-range electronic warfare operations. And then throughout the rest of the force, all of the services have their own technical reconnaissance bureaus that are focused on sensing and reconnaissance, and electronic countermeasure units, which are focused on defensive and offensive electronic attack and other forms of countermeasures. In terms of the specific capabilities that Chinese forces are fielding, they have a range of low and high-powered jammers and directed energy weapons. But one of the greatest challenges that Chinese forces are now facing for the United States and its allies is that the PLA has started to network large numbers of both passive and active sensors in multi-static and in completely passive networks. These are able to detect forces even if they're not emitting without emissions. And so it makes it very challenging for US forces, for instance, to know when they're being detected and possibly when they're being targeted. As we looked at Russian EW organization, similarly, the Russian electronic warfare forces have undergone significant change. In 2009, they underwent a series of reforms that were informed by some Russian problems that were faced during the 2008 invasion of Georgia. And they stood up within the general staff a dedicated electronic warfare unit with a specific commander and a inter-service training center that would consolidate some of the training from throughout the different service branches and independent combat arms. Electronic warfare units can be found throughout the different services and independent combat arms, and they're organized into different capabilities for electronic attack, defensive electronic operations or countermeasures, and then capabilities to be able to detect, sensing, and deny adversary exploitation of the EMS. In terms of the capabilities that Russian military is presenting, in general, they're less advanced than those presented by China, but some of the same technology priorities are consistent. They're pursuing more mobile forces, more integrated forces, more agile and multi-static capabilities, and then more automated capabilities that leverage artificial intelligence or cognitive capabilities to be able to coordinate operations throughout the electromagnetic spectrum and conduct battle management. Additionally, the Russian armed forces have benefited from extensive operations in Syria and Ukraine and other areas around the world that they've used to refine some of their concepts and then further test them in exercises, which in turn has informed some of their capability development. Now over to you, Bryan.
Thanks, Tim. And so looking at the US side, a couple of things jumped out at our assessment, which obviously there's a lot more elements to it than what's on the screen here. But a couple of big things are that the investment DoD is making in new electromagnetic warfare systems is increasing as systems that were being developed over the last decade come to fruition and begin to get fielded. So procurement is on its way up. Research and development of the next generation of systems, however, is down, and that's partly because the amount of money available for electromagnetic warfare ends up being more or less about the same from year to year. So if more money goes to procurement, less money has been going to research and development. And these numbers are from CRS, the Congressional Research Service. Also, what's notable is that the majority of investment is going towards a small number of relatively large systems that are mostly devoted to protecting legacy platforms. So systems for the protection of aircraft that have self-protection jammers, or of ships that have counter missile systems that use electromagnetic warfare. So those systems are now predominant inside the DoD's investment portfolio, which is probably an approach we need to move away from if we're going to try to get an advantage. Next slide, Tim. So when we start to look at the asymmetries between these investments and organizational constructs and doctrine between the PRC, or China, Russia, and the United States, several asymmetries jump out, and I'll just highlight a few of them. So the biggest thing is the fact that in pretty much every confrontation, the United States is going to be the away team, which puts that at the vulnerability of not being able to use the same resident or installed electromagnetic sensors as the Chinese and Russians might be able to as the home team. So they're able to use lower frequencies, longer range systems, passive systems to a greater degree, installed and redundant communications that allow them to have secure communications. Those are things that the resident or home team tends to have that the away team has less of an advantage in. And so that puts the US in the position of being a little bit more predictable from the Chinese or Russian perspective, because we have to come with everything we're going to fight with, and we might have inherently less flexibility in how we employ the force. So changing that asymmetry may be something that's beneficial to the US. Another big asymmetry was in how we are organized and how equipped our forces are equipped. In the Russian and Chinese cases, they've got a centralized organization that tends to drive the doctrine and drive technology priorities throughout their EW organizations. They've got strong leadership at the top. They've got strategic level organizations that manage their national level electromagnetic warfare missions. In the US, it's much more diffuse. So we've got organizations throughout DoD in charge of electromagnetic warfare. And our systems are not pushed down to lower echelons as they are in the Chinese and Russian militaries, which means our field forces don't necessarily have the ability to distribute to the degree they might need to, because those electromagnetic warfare systems are not numerous enough to be able to get sent out with every small unit that might get deployed. And then the last one is this idea of electromagnetic spectrum operations, sort of thinking of the electromagnetic spectrum as an area in which a lot of interrelated activities occur simultaneously, meaning communications affect radar operations, and jamming affects radar, and passive sensors are affected by electromagnetic effects in the atmosphere, as well as by some of your own emissions. So the fact that it's a very highly interdependent environment is something we think of as electromagnetic spectrum operations, and our ability to manage that through electromagnetic battle management is something we're trying to pursue as a capability. In the Russian and Chinese cases, their doctrine doesn't identify that as an approach that they want to take, and therefore they're not investing necessarily as much in the kinds of systems that would allow them to better manage operations in the spectrum between competing activities like sensing, communications, and countermeasures. Next slide. And then those asymmetries start to point to some potential technology priorities that we should be pursuing. So the first thing is not to try to overcome the inherent disadvantage that the United States has, where China is able to combine their civil and military sectors, create a very comprehensive system approach to defeat our systems. So instead of trying to match them system for system, we should try to look for ways to get an advantage and impose challenges on the Chinese. That gets to the second set of priorities, which is instead of operating our active systems in an area where we're likely being sensed passively, like the away team would be in the case of the United States forces operating in the South or East China Seas, shift to a passive and LPI-LPD approach focused on electromagnetic protection so that we avoid counter detection, we avoid giving the adversary an easy targeting solution, make the picture that we're presenting to them more complex so that we're less predictable, and their system approach to defeat us is less able to gain traction. And that gets to the third priority, which is to employ more cognitive and adaptive both control systems and electromagnetic systems. So being able to be more adaptive in the spectrum, getting more of a decision-centric approach as shown on the right-hand side instead of a more predictive forecast-centric approach in our electromagnetic spectrum operations will help us to be less predictable, less able to be defeated by the relatively static system of systems that the Chinese and Russians have developed in order to counter us in the electromagnetic spectrum. And the last thing is to take advantage of some existing strengths that the United States could play on. So the fact that we're developing electromagnetic battle management, the fact that we have a strong live virtual constructive culture, if not the fully instantiated systems yet, and the fact that we're pursuing open architecture, which can provide additional adaptability, both by allowing you to mix and match systems in new ways in terms of software and in terms of hardware. So those are all things that we should be exploiting as advantages going forward to increase the adaptability of the force, reduce its predictability, and undermine the ability of the Chinese and Russians to use this kind of comprehensive approach to defeat us in the spectrum. Next slide. And that's the last of it. And so we're going to turn it back over to Dr. Dan Patt from the Hudson Institute, who is an adjunct fellow there. And he's going to moderate the discussion with our panelists. Thank you very much. Dan?
All right. Thanks, Brian. And I'm thrilled to be up on our virtual stage with this distinguished panel. I'm looking forward to their reflections. So we just got to hear a summary from Bryan and Tim in their new report. And they certainly aren't alone in suggesting that the US military is behind in electromagnetic spectrum operations compared to China and Russia. This is corroborated by several government and other external reports. So I want to get right to the heart of it by asking each of our panelists to reflect on an opening question in turn. And that question is this. So given an environment where it looks like DoD's budget outlook is flat, how can the US regain an upper hand in the EM spectrum? And what are our major blockers? So Congressman Bacon, I'd like to start off with you. How do we regain an advantage and what are our impediments?
First of all, we got to realize we do have a problem. So I appreciate the Hudson report. I agree with it. There is no doubt we had EW dominance in the 80s and 90s, totally dominating in Desert Storm, for example. But when we had that unipolar moment and there wasn't a threat, a perceived threat, we defunded, walked away from it, didn't upgrade. Whereas China and Russia saw what we did in Desert Storm and they went on steroids investing in EW. So they were building up their capabilities while we were walking away because we felt confident. And EW is typically that way. If you feel like you're a dominating force, you don't have a threat, you tend to defund EW. But when you know you're in a tough fight, you want to get people to the target and back safely, and there's lots of threats, EW then becomes much more needed. So understand we have a problem. One of the issues that we've had, but we've tried to fix over the last 2 years, no one was in charge of EW. In a sense, everybody felt like they owned a piece of this, a slice of it. Somebody in the Pentagon needs to know they own EW. I would talk to a service and they would say, yeah, our service chief owns it, or our vice chief, they own everything. You need someone at like the 1 or 2 star level that says, this is my problem that I'm responsible for in this service. But more importantly, we needed that in the joint staff. I think we have that fixed. We had a team that was looking at all the gaps in the Pentagon, and we had a 2-star in charge. We just got to sustain that. Also, you need a hardwired funding process for EW. If it's embedded in tons of other funding lines, you can't really have an enterprise view. So we need to have an enterprise view of EW that goes to the shortfalls versus China and Russia. And so those are some of the things that I think we have to identify a problem. People need to be responsible. You need to have a hardwired funding process. And we have tried to push the military in this direction. I'll just close with this comment. We've had lots of studies. I appreciate the Hudson study. The military's been doing them. We got to stop studying at some point and start acting, and start executing. That's my frustration. There's a lot of analysis and studies in the Pentagon. I want to start seeing action and start working diligently to close this gap with a plan. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Congressman. And your observations there about the structure of funding an organization around platforms and our legacy platforms, and not always these new capabilities we need, I think is a really important one. Congressman Langevin, I'll turn it over to you and ask, what's your take? How can we take the lead back, and what are our blockers?
Yeah, and so I want to echo a lot of the points that Don just made. He's spot on. We surely do need someone in charge, but we have to recognize that our enemies and adversaries have absolutely invested in these asymmetric technologies that will either undermine our advantage, or they've invested in, and so that gives them the advantage. And our job is to really undo that damage, if you will, that's been done, and regain our superiority. And so we have to recognize that we are going to be operating in environments that are contested and congested, whether we like it or not. And we've got to be able to have nimble plans to operate in those types of environments. We have to use spectrum more quietly and efficiently, and that will open up the battlefield of the future in a lot of ways. So I would also say, and Don touched about this, on the governance side, we really do need someone in charge. We need to identify an office and put a policy person in charge, like a deputy assistant secretary, to be responsible for the strategy implementation. We don't have that right now, if we don't, the current strategy is going to end up like the 2013 and the 2017 EMS strategies. So I'm bound to determine that that's not going to happen. We're going to get it right this time. Also, on the acquisition side, we really have to move away from hardware-centric systems. EMS really requires software-centric systems that are flexible and networked, and that's not the way it is right now. We need to move in the direction of having our acquisitions be much more software-centric, that are flexible and adaptable, recognizing that we're going to need to upgrade and be flexible when new capabilities come online, when new threats are identified, and we've got to mitigate them. That's the way we move forward.
Thanks. I think I resonate with that point, that the software-defined world requires more adaptability in our approach. Marin, what's your take on this? What does it take to give the lead back to the U.S. and what stands in the way?
Well, I think I'm very much in alignment with the two representatives. I see it principally as being increasing the internal alignment inside and coherence inside of the Defense Department. So, multiple interested offices on the OSD side, and then even more interested stakeholders between the Joint Staff and the combatant commands and the services on the military side. So it's definitely the range of stakeholders as the conception of what constitutes MSO has expanded over time, and managing all of that is a challenge. And I think with prompting from Congress, their strategy and implementation plan ideally will go a long way towards that, hopefully. But there's a lot of culture change that has to occur as those very different communities need to change their behavior. So I think that's really going to be it's the strategy is a starting point, but then culture change is probably the more significant actual behavioral change that we need to see. And then as Congressman Langevin mentioned, this software-defined world is one that is being driven by the commercial sector, and so I think the other piece of that is increasing the collaboration with that industry, right? With that dual use industry. And I think in the operational context, there's so much more that can be done to bring that in. And then at the strategic level, which your report got at, really the need for the United States to compete in the standards context, so that we're not just stuck with standards that are defined by, in particular, China at this point. And that requires a whole new level of collaboration because those are all industry-led venues. So that's something that we're certainly thinking hard about and starting to take action on, but we need to move out there as well.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. And your point on culture change, I think is a useful one, even if that one sometimes feels very intimidating to try to bring into action. Dave, what's your take? What does it look like from inside the building?
I want to fist pound that software defined point, and so particularly against a flat and declining budget, and so the way that I've been talking about that in the building is what I've been calling investment efficiency. We spend a lot of time talking about the bottom line of EW and is there enough investment, and we're falling short on all these things, but one of the things we're looking at is how efficient are we being with that investment? Because EW is unique in that I can transfer capabilities between systems, I can transfer capabilities between services, and I don't need redundant systems. I don't need to build the system twice. So if I can spend $1 and get $5 worth of capability because all the services benefit from it, then I can achieve an investment efficiency that allows me to absorb a flat budget or a declining budget and still gain capability. And I think we see movement in the Army and the Marine Corps as they head towards some of their systems with their SOSA and CMOS types of standards that allow that type of capability migration between systems. And so that type of investment efficiency we're trying to amplify and then cross-pollinate and establish the communication lines with the other services so that we can see the Navy invest in something that the Army benefits from, and the Army invest in something that the Air Force benefits from. And that's something that I think is particularly useful when you look at EW. One of the other challenges, I think, is EP, is electronic protection. And so when we talk about EW, and Bryan mentioned this in his brief, talking about countering Chinese EW systems. Well, those Chinese EW systems aren't attacking our EW systems necessarily. They're attacking our radar systems and our comms and our GPS and PNT systems. Those systems are not managed by DoD EW. Right? Those aren't developed by the DoD EW community. And so what that means is that when we focus on EW investment and how do we achieve EMS superiority through EW, the answer is we may not be able to, because where we need to be focusing on is the electronic protection in our radars and our comms and our GPS systems so that those can continue to survive in a contested environment. And I think that a lot of the EW community has been somewhat admiring the electromagnetic interference problem with a recognition that the EW community can't actually fix that, right? It requires that the radar, the comms, and those PNT communities are paying attention to their EMS survivability. And that's a point that we've been amplifying within the department, that we need to be red teaming our spectrum using systems. We need to create OPFOR that allows us to go out into the field and jam our comms and jam our GPS and jam our radars and train the operators how to operate in those situations, as well as determine how survivable all those are those systems under those circumstances. I think another important piece of EMS survivability is being able to operate passively, right? So to not depend on our radars, not depend on actively emitting to get battle space awareness. And this is something that I think EW is primed to support. And I don't think it's a huge budget movement to make it happen. That EW systems, sensors in particular, right, if they would provide data outside of the box, consumption by a broader audience, right, so consumption by the commander, you can build a pretty interesting passive battle space picture without any new sensors, just by connecting the existing sensors. And so to the point earlier about standards, right on, right? If we start creating the standards that tell EW systems, this is how you should communicate your perception of the spectrum to other users, then suddenly we can crowdsource awareness of the spectrum and we can achieve passive operations. And that starts to reduce our dependency on emitting anything, which then increases our survivability and provides a counter targeting capability. So I think there's opportunities there. I don't think there's big dollar, in some cases they are not big dollar investments. They are just changes in paradigm on how we have traditionally developed and deployed and managed spectrum using systems.
Thanks, Abe. And maybe a little later I'll return to that and that theme of what we can do with what's the new opportunity space that's opened up in this software-defined world? But for now, I'll go back to Congressman Bacon, who you in your opening remarks, sir, you hinted at upcoming organizational change. And certainly over the past couple of decades, the Pentagon has made, often at congressional direction, changes in the organization, its own organization, to try to improve EMS governance. Have, in your opinion, these reforms been successful? And what motivates you around what you hinted at is the need for this singular responsibility for EMS superiority?
Well, in the 90s, we had a 2-star in charge of the Air Force, so VW. And then it went into an office where a colonel was sharing like 5 or 6 different responsibilities. And just see it in the Air Force alone, and literally in the Joint Staff, we didn't really have anyone in charge. We had stuff at Stratcom. So in other words, at OSD, we had some leadership there, but it was dissipated. There was just really nobody in charge. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, when you talk to one of the services, I go, who's in charge? They go, the vice chief is, or the chief is. Yeah, that doesn't cut it because they're doing 100 things. You got to have an office with a flag officer or SES responsible. Now, I think the Joint Staff is preferable to me because you got the warfighting focus, but I could do the OSD too, more on the policy side. You need to have a team there somehow. Now, there has been a 2-star in the Joint Staff in the last year and a half doing the analysis of what we need to make EW look like in the Joint Staff, OSD, and the services. But it was a temporary position. We need to make that permanent. There needs to be a permanent person. We need to force it. And as you mentioned, if it wasn't for Congress, none of this would be done. We have had to force this on the services and the Joint Staff. In fact, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force recently said it was embarrassing that the Congress has had to tell us to do this, but we have. Working with Congressman Langevin and the HASC, we have wrote this in the law. We were nice about it the first year. Second year, it's okay, no, wait, so we're serious. You got to deliver on this. There's some things that they're 2 years overdue on already, coming back with a review to us. And so I guess my takeaway here is Congress cannot take our foot off the gas on this. If we do, I'm pretty sure that DoD left to their own devices right now would focus on the F-35, which is important, aircraft carriers, the nuclear, all the stuff's important. And they just sort of fill that void if Congress isn't actually pushing them on the EW side. So I think Congress has to push this and keep the pressure on, ensure there's deliverables coming out of the Pentagon or the Joint Staff, OSD in particular. And you hope from that the services align themselves under that. I was in favor of making the electronic magnetic spectrum a separate domain. I frankly think that is scientifically accurate. It is a physical domain. Without control of the EMS, you can have the best aircraft, the best ships, the best tanks, the best whatever. And if you can't talk, you can't get radar, you can't use GPS, these systems are easily defeated. And I just think it's a reality that this electronic magnetic spectrum is a physical spectrum. But I would tell you, our services and the Joint Staff have shied away from that. I think unless we can't get the strategy right, the doctrine right, we're going to be a little 1 off, 2 off, 3 off when it comes to implementation. And so in the end, Congress, I've learned my lesson learned. If Congress is not pushing this area, the Pentagon will not deliver.
One quick follow-up question. So if there's a position, a lead for EM spectrum superiority that stood up, and yet the acquisition funding is still spread across lots of more platform-centric efforts, do you think that the Pentagon should modify its budget request in any way, or do you think that can be influenced through requirements or other methods?
Interesting enough, if I push this domain, I'm told by folks in the Pentagon, we don't want to do it because you end up having to spend more money to fix the problem, which is not a good way to do business. I'd rather honestly address a problem. You still only got a budget that you can work with, but I think we're denying there's a problem if you don't acknowledge the EMS as a domain. And it's like air. You want to dominate the air and deny it to your adversary. Well, the electronic magnetic spectrum is the same thing, same principle with C, same principle with everything else. And I don't know that it has to be a specific service. That's another fear people have. we have cyber today. Cyber is not in any individual service. Of course, we have a combatant command overseeing it. But so I think you could have EMS as a separate domain, like cyber, distributed between the services. But there's probably got to be a COCOM that wears the ring that's in charge of this. My thoughts.
Thanks. Congressman Langevin, over to you. So last I checked, there was no budget request out yet. But based on what you know, do you think that DoD is prioritizing the right EMS capabilities in its investments, or what else should be emphasized in its budget request?
No, I don't think they're prioritizing the right things in the budget, but although we haven't seen the budgets come out, but in past ones we can kind of identify where they're going. But I'll be interested to see what this budget prioritizes. The bottom line is the requirements right now are really hardware driven, with software treated as really a back office support system, and that really needs to change. We really need to prioritize software-centric focus with open architecture and interoperability. I think that one of the problems is that the services and the budgets revolve around protecting legacy systems like ships and airplanes. And the bottom line is we need to be more nimble. We need to innovate. We need to focus more on software as a technology, and that's adaptable. So we'll wait to see what the budget has, but as we go through the NDAA process, I'm going to drive this, and hopefully my colleague Don agrees, and others on the committee will agree that we need to be much more software centric, that is flexible, nimble, especially in working with commercial sector as new capabilities are developed. We want to be able to plug and play, if you will, and be able to update, upgrade seamlessly, and give the warfighter the best capabilities that they need.
Yeah, and you've hit again on this theme about needs for adaptability and the needs to be more software centric, and how the Pentagon operates. Are there places where you think that the Pentagon has done that well, or are there places where you think its own processes get in the way?
Trying to see where things in terms of where the Pentagon has done that well. It's not the norm, right? We need to be more flexible going forward. So I'm struggling to think of an example where it's where they've been nimble in that area. It just doesn't. The process is so big and cumbersome doesn't allow it to be.
Yeah, fair enough. Do you think?
I guess let me say this on. I guess one area where we have excelled, we've been better, is in building submarines. And so in the past, we used to buy and build submarines in 1 year. And when we did the Ohio submarine, when it was first built, the design was only 2% complete when we started building. When we did Virginia, now it was 50% design complete before we even started building. And Ohio, the Columbia class will be 90% complete in its design. And so again, they're much more focused on thinking things through more clearly, and then building to requirements, but remaining adaptable and upgradable. So I think probably that's the best example I can give right now.
Yeah, thanks for that. Marin, over to you. One of the goals of the DoD EMS Superiority Strategy is improving the ability of the U.S. military to share spectrum with civilian users. What do you think are the key capabilities or technologies that we need, and what actions do we need to take to facilitate this? And how's DoD doing in that?
Let me start with how they're doing. I mean, I think they're really doing some cutting edge work in the sharing space. But unfortunately, I mean, a lot of this conversation has been about the complexity of bounding what EMS actually is, right? Because it's so highly interdependent with so much of the whole business of the department. So there's been some really, again, cutting edge work in the sharing space driven out of necessity, but that also has a lot of application and can start to lay the foundation for some of the warfighting capability that's needed, and bridging that gap, making that connection across organizations, across cultures, across structures has been much less. There's been much less progress there. So I think there's a lot of unused, untapped potential that is both recognized and being applied in that sharing area. It's also clear to everybody, I think, that the sharing thing is not going away, right? And those pressures are only going to increase. And so I guess what I would say here is that the technology is ahead of the department's ability to fully implement it and leverage it. But there's still lots of additional work to be done as we move to this paradigm. I think there is real, it does create, the necessity creates an opportunity to lean into that in a more deliberate way for the department. I think there's a fear that if they do that too aggressively, that they will lose more spectrum than that they will invite a greater loss. But that's a sort of strategic choice I think they need to make. But they need clearly a stronger, sustained understanding of what that loss or reposition looks like, because they're almost always playing catch up in that regard. So that's I think needs help there. And then again, I think they can do a lot more to leverage some of the development, and a lot of it's very software dependent, to make more use of it in an operational context, not just in the CONUS sharing and context and communities that it is being developed for. So I think there's lots of opportunity there. Not all of it being fully taken advantage of.
Yeah, it's certainly I mean, just times have changed so dramatically over the past few decades. But you know, as you say, it seems like there's still lots of opportunity for change ahead.
Well, and the more that we are forced to do that domestically, the more it will force our operational systems to have to take that into account. And that makes us better prepared for the CONUS environment, right? Yeah. So again, we can lean into that, or we can go grudgingly. And right now we're sort of more in the grudging camp, I would argue.
Yeah. Dave, you know, in your response to the opening question, you know, you hinted at passive capabilities, and it certainly seems that EMS superiority will depend on the ability of forces to manage their own emissions while still being able to sense, communicate, and fight. And this is certainly the kind of thing that we spent time talking about together at DARPA. With the capabilities that might help us coordinate, you know, disparate radios and radars and jammers and decoys, so often seem to fall between the cracks between services or programs. What can DoD do to improve its ability to develop and field this kind of capability? How does the DoD structure affect outcomes in this area?
Yeah, you know, good question, Dan. One of the challenges with the EM battle management tools and the spectrum coordination tools that are out there is that in the absence of sensors and emitters that can communicate or network with those tools, right, you end up with a static spectrum management system. And we have that, right? We have static spectrum allocation And I think as we see the spectrum becoming more congested, we're starting to learn that there's phenomenology happening between spectrum using systems that weren't originally anticipated, right? So high sensitivity receivers that are detecting things that aren't actually in their band, right? And it's causing interference. And we have emitters that are emitting noise and harmonics in bands that are outside of their bands. And so they're interfering with receivers. And so there's phenomenology that doesn't get managed with these EM battle management tools and these types of static tools. I think one of the ways that we get to effectiveness of that management is we start to force those sensing systems and those emitting systems to provide information outside of their box, right? Whether that is, here is what I see in the spectrum, and here is the standardized way with which I report that information, or here is what I intend to do in the spectrum, and here is the standardized way with which I report that information. So that these battle management tools, these spectrum management tools, can actually be dynamic, right? So that on the fly, they can be coordinating spectrum operations and deconflicting interference, rather than having to be pre-planned management tools where suddenly when something unexpected happens, when there's a harmonic that interferes with the receiver, that there's no way to account for it because the battle management tool isn't real time, that there is no mechanism that allows that tool to understand what's going on in the spectrum and then very quickly change what's happening in the spectrum. I mean, everything that's happening in the spectrum is speed of light, right? Those are speed of light operations. As soon as you put an operator in the loop, right, you've reduced the efficiency of managing that. And as soon as you then say that it's static, well, okay, the spectrum is changing so quickly that by the time you take a spectrum allocation management tool and you change the plan, right? The plan is probably not going to be good. It's going to be obsolete by the time it actually gets implemented. So I think getting to a point where our spectrum using systems are providing information outside of the box, right? For the broader consumption of the force, right? So that you can do spectrum management. That's where we need to be going. That's where standards become very important, and that's where enforcing those standards becomes very important. And I think we're starting to see that in some of the particularly the Army and the Marine Corps systems, and we're trying to cross-pollinate that again to the other services.
Yeah, so you think that's a fair summary, that there's this architectural principle about sharing information, being able to expose that, which will drive this better coordination.
Yes, right. So I think we have a historical paradigm where we consider a lot of our operational systems as independent, despite supporting a joint mission, right? And so radars are built to provide information to radar operators, and EW systems are built to provide information to EW operators, right? But however, right, if you start providing connectivity between those radar systems, EW systems, the comm systems, to a spectrum management system, and in real time, so that intent and perception are being exchanged between those systems, then you can start to very rapidly adjust how the spectrum is being used, deconflict interference, and be more efficient about spectrum operations, and as well as understand passively what's going on. Right? And we've seen tools that have taken information that already exists, correlated it, and created heat maps of what's going on in the spectrum, right? And I know you and I were familiar with a radio map program at DARPA that did that over very narrow bands. But what that does is it provides very good awareness on what's going on in the spectrum. And the way that it did it was essentially by crowdsourcing spectrum using systems. And I think we need to be heading in that direction. How do we start connecting our sensors so that we can build collective awareness across all of our systems?
Yeah. There's always new opportunity for invention and discovery in RF. But what you just described, moving towards this better coordination, do you think that that's a matter of invention, or does the technological capability to achieve that exist today? And is it really more about organizing, incentivizing, and engineering?
I think it is the latter, right? I think much of it exists. Probably 85% of that solution already exists, and it's just a matter of getting our sensors to exchange data as well as exchange what their capability is, because for the most part, you've got apples and oranges and bananas that are out there using the spectrum. And if you just say, hey, report your information to tell us what you're doing, well, you need to understand what each of those sensors is capable of so that you can collectively put them together and get that picture. So So it's not just, hey, here's what frequency I'm using and here's what I'm sensing in that frequency, but it's also understanding, here's what the sensitivity of my receiver is, right? Here is what the capability of my device is, so that that can also be factored into the development system. So in that regard, I think connecting what we have would potentially provide a profound opportunity for spectrum awareness and real-time coordinated spectrum operations. And then that allows us to focus our investment on that other 15%, right, that we really think will significantly advance that capability, and then factor that in as we move forward.
So Dan, can I dive in here really quickly just to make the point that some of this dynamic spectrum access and management, those are the kinds of things that the NSC has helped to develop for the domestic sharing context. And then it really is a question of relatively minor modifications to some of our existing systems to create that open interface, right, that allows for the software that's been developed to be utilized in a broader context, right? So I think I completely agree. We have absolutely have tech on the shelf, and this was an exact analogy to, or a specific example of some of the challenges between organizational cultures, the spectrum management culture and the EW culture, and organizations that are the gaps that are hard to bridge, where relevant technology exists. It's just getting it into the right context so that it can be pulled over and implemented.
And I think I like that, right? That's a relatively optimistic twist, that we have the technology, we have the building blocks, and in many ways it's a matter of organizing ourselves to execute that appropriately. And that seems
more fundamentally, it is really about talking about it in a way that crosses those domains between the two communities, that they understand the potential, right? So it's we don't even have the same language. So I really think this is a human problem that I think we can get after, but we need to.
Well, hopefully today's panel contributed ever so slightly to advancing that conversation that we need to have. And with that, I will turn this back over to Bryan.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. That was a fantastic conversation. I'm glad it ended on a good note. There are opportunities out there for us to be able to get spectrum superiority back. A lot of it might involve being able to work better with other users of the spectrum in the civilian and the commercial spheres. So that's really an opportunity that we should be exploiting. It's very encouraging. But it was great to hear about some of the ways that everybody's thinking about improved governance, being able to enable this more adaptive approach to using the spectrum, which is sort of key to us getting spectrum superiority back in the face of competitors who may not have that same adaptability. And it also redounds to our ability to work with the commercial space as well. So fantastic conversation. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of our panel members, Congressman Jim Langevin, Congressman Don Bacon, Dave Tremper from OSD ANS, and also Maren Lead from the National Spectrum Consortium. And of course, Dr. Dan Patt for moderating the conversation, and to Timothy Walton for working with me on the study. Thank you all for being here today, and we appreciate your time with us at the Hudson Institute. We know that everybody's got Zoom fatigue, and we're glad you took an hour out today to look at this conversation. So thank you all for tuning in today, and until next time, thank you from the Hudson Institute.
Thank you. Keep on jamming.